The 89-year-old woman gripped her walker as the landlord stood in her doorway, waving the eviction notice inches from her face. $12 late, and you're out. I don't care if you've lived here 40 years, pack your things, he shouted, loud enough for the entire hallway to hear. She tried to hand him the money with trembling fingers, apologizing through tears, but he slapped her hand away and the bills scattered across the floor. He pointed at the notice and told her she had 24 hours. But 3 weeks later in court, the judge read one line from her file, and his gavel came down so hard it echoed through the room like a gunshot. Because that one line didn't just prove the landlord wrong. It exposed what he'd been doing to 6 other elderly tenants. And what the judge said next made the landlord's lawyer stand up and beg to leave. Before we go any further, I need to know, where are you watching this from right now? And what time is it? Drop your city and time zone in the comments, because I need you to understand something. Elderly people are being evicted every single day over amounts of money most of us spend on coffee. And most of them have no one to fight for them. So hit that subscribe button right now and smash that like button, because what happens next in this courtroom is exactly why we need to pay attention when landlords abuse their power. Sometimes the system actually works, but only when someone refuses to stay silent. Stay with me, because this story is about to show you what happens when a judge finally says, enough is enough. Her name was Helen Carver, and she was 89 years old. Helen had lived in the same apartment for 43 years. Unit 3B in the Riverside Garden Apartments, a 3-story brick building on the east side of town that had once been considered nice, but had slowly deteriorated as ownership changed hands and maintenance disappeared. Her apartment was small, 1 bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, a living room with a window that overlooked the parking lot. But it was hers, or at least it had been hers for longer than most people kept anything. She'd moved in with her husband Arthur in 1981. They'd been looking for a place they could afford on Arthur's salary as a mechanic and Helen's income from her job at the textile factory. The rent had been $240 a month back then, which had seemed like a lot, but was manageable. They'd raised their daughter in that apartment, Michelle, who was now 61, and lived 2 states away with her own family. Michelle called once a week, visited maybe twice a year, sent cards on birthdays and holidays. She was a good daughter, but she had her own life, her own struggles. Arthur had died 19 years ago. Heart attack in the middle of the night. Helen had woken up beside him and had known immediately. The stillness, the cold. She'd called 911 anyway, had waited for the paramedics, had known the whole time it was pointless. She'd lived alone ever since, the apartment growing quieter each year, the walls seeming to close in a little more with every birthday she celebrated by herself. Helen had worked at the textile factory until it closed in 2003. She'd been 71 then, had planned to work a few more years, but hadn't been given the choice. The factory had shut down, moved production overseas, left 300 workers without jobs and without the pensions they'd been promised. Helen had gotten a small settlement, $8,000 for 27 years of work. It had seemed like an insult, but there was nothing she could do about it. She lived on Social Security now, $941 a month. Her rent had increased over the years, slowly at first, then faster as new landlords bought the building. It was now $650 a month for her tiny 1-bedroom. Utilities were another $130. Medicare Part B was another $174. That left her with negative $13 before she bought food or medications or anything else. Helen made it work the way millions of elderly Americans do. She didn't. She was behind on everything. She paid her rent first because she couldn't afford to be homeless, then utilities because she needed heat and lights. Then she scraped together what she could for food and medications. She ate once a day, sometimes less. She took half doses of her blood pressure medication to make it last. She hadn't bought new clothes in 11 years. She kept the heat at 58 in winter and didn't run the air conditioning in summer, even when temperatures hit 95. She'd developed a persistent cough that her doctor said was probably bronchitis, but that Helen couldn't afford to treat. So she just coughed, and coughed, and lived. The building had changed ownership again 18 months ago. The new owner was a man named Gerald Vickers, 42 years old, who'd bought the Riverside Garden Apartments as an investment property. Gerald owned 6 other buildings in the area, all low-income rentals, all managed the same way: squeeze every dollar possible from tenants, do the absolute minimum maintenance required by law, and evict quickly and ruthlessly anyone who fell behind on rent. Gerald had immediately raised rents by 12%, the maximum allowed under local ordinance. Helen's rent had gone from $580 to $650. The increase had broken her already impossible budget. She'd tried to talk to Gerald about it, had explained that she was on a fixed income, that she'd been a good tenant for 43 years, that she paid on time every month. Gerald had been unmoved. If you can't afford it, move somewhere cheaper. There was nowhere cheaper. Not in this town. Not for a single elderly woman with no car and no family support. Helen had tried to find other housing, had called every subsidized housing complex in the area. All had waiting lists years long. So she'd stayed and had tried to make it work. For 16 months she'd managed. She'd paid her rent on time, even if it meant not eating for days, even if it meant her cough got worse and her hands shook from malnutrition. But last month, October, Helen had made a mistake. Her Social Security check had come on the 3rd, as always. She'd gone to the bank, had withdrawn cash, had carefully counted out the $650 for rent. But on her way to the building office to pay, she'd stopped at the small bodega on the corner because she'd been out of food for 3 days and had felt dizzy and weak. She'd bought a small bag of rice, a can of beans, and a loaf of bread. $3.78. When she'd gotten home and had recounted her rent money, she'd realized she'd accidentally used a $10 bill from the rent stack to pay for the groceries. She now had $640.22. She was $12 short. Helen had panicked. She'd searched her apartment for any money she might have stashed away. She'd checked coat pockets, old purses, the jar where she sometimes kept change. She'd found $1 in quarters and 37 cents in dimes and pennies. $641.59 total. Still short by $8.41. She'd gone to the building office anyway, had explained what happened to the property manager, a tired woman in her 50s named Denise. "I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. I can bring you the rest in 3 days when I get paid from the senior center." Helen volunteered at a senior center twice a week, helping in the kitchen. They paid her $40 a month, cash, under the table. It wasn't much, but it helped. Denise had looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carver. Mr. Vickers has a strict policy. Full payment by the 5th of the month or we start eviction proceedings. No exceptions." "But it's $8. I've never been late in 43 years. "I know, but it's not my decision. I'll note that you tried to pay, but you need to talk to Mr. Vickers directly." Helen had called Gerald's office. His assistant had told her he was unavailable. Helen had left a message explaining the situation, asking for just 3 days. She'd never gotten a call back. On October 6th, there had been a knock on Helen's door. When she'd opened it, Gerald Vickers had been standing there, tall and well-dressed, holding a piece of paper. An eviction notice. "Mrs. Carver, you're late on rent." "I know. I left you a message. I can pay you the rest in 2 days. $12 late." Gerald had held up the notice. "Says here you owe $12. That's the late fee added to what you're short." "A late fee? But I've never—" "It's in your lease. $5 late fee after the 5th of the month. You're also short by $8.41, which I'm rounding up to $9. That's $12 you owe me on top of the rent." Helen's hands had started shaking. "Please, I can pay you everything by Friday. I just need—" "Friday isn't today. You've got 24 hours to pay in full or you're out." He'd waved the notice inches from her face, his voice rising, echoing down the hallway where neighbors were starting to peer out their doors. $12 late and you're out. I don't care if you've lived here 40 years. Pack your things." Helen had reached into her purse with trembling fingers, had pulled out the small amount of cash she'd found, $9 in bills and coins. She'd tried to hand it to him. "Here, this is $9. I'll get the other $3 by tomorrow. I promise." Gerald had slapped her hand. Not hard enough to injure her, but hard enough that the bills and coins had scattered across the floor, rolling and fluttering. "I don't want your dirty change. You pay in full or you leave. 24 hours. Helen had dropped to her knees, apologizing through tears, trying to gather the money. "I'm sorry. Please, I'm so sorry." Gerald had pointed at the eviction notice he'd left on her doorstep. 24 hours, Mrs. Carver, or I'm changing the locks." He turned and walked away, leaving Helen on her knees in her doorway, crying, while her neighbors watched and did nothing. Helen had spent that night in panic. She'd called Michelle, her daughter, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. Michelle had been horrified. "Mom, how much do you need?" $12. "But I don't want to burden you." "Mom, stop. I'm sending you $50 right now. Check your account in the morning." The money had been there by 8 a.m. Helen had withdrawn it immediately, had gone to the building office, and had tried to pay Denise. But Denise had shaken her head. "I'm sorry. Mr. Vickers already filed the eviction. You'll have to deal with it in court now." "But I have the money. All of it." "It doesn't matter. Once it's filed, it goes through the courts." Helen had left the office, the money still in her hand, feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She'd gone home, sat in her small living room, and had stared at the walls for hours. 43 years. She'd lived there for 43 years. And now she was being thrown out over $12. But Helen had something Gerald didn't know about. She had a neighbor. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 72 years old, a retired union electrician, and he lived in Unit 3C, right next door to Helen. Marcus had heard the entire confrontation between Helen and Gerald. Had heard Gerald yelling, had heard Helen crying, and Marcus had gotten angry. Marcus had a history with landlords like Gerald. He'd spent 40 years fighting for workers' rights, had seen plenty of bosses who treated people like they were disposable. He wasn't going to watch it happen to Helen without doing something. Marcus had contacted a legal aid organization he'd worked with during his union days. He'd explained Helen's situation, and they'd connected him with a lawyer named Amanda Pierce. Amanda was 39 years old, had been practicing tenant rights law for 12 years, and had a reputation for taking on slumlords and winning. Amanda had met with Helen 2 days before the court date. She'd listened to Helen's story, had reviewed the eviction notice, had looked at Helen's rent payment history. 43 years of on-time payments, documented in bank statements Helen had carefully kept. Amanda's eyes had narrowed when she'd seen the late fee clause in the lease. Did you know about this fee? No, I've never been late before. This fee wasn't in your original lease from 1981, was it? I don't think so. But the lease has been updated so many times over the years, I'm not sure. Amanda had made notes. Mrs. Carver, I think we can fight this, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Helen had nodded, tears in her eyes. I just don't want to lose my home. You're not going to, I promise. The court date had been set for 3 weeks after the eviction notice. Housing Court, Judge Raymond Kowalski presiding. Judge Kowalski was 63 years old, had been on the bench for 17 years, and had a reputation for being fair but tough. He didn't tolerate landlords who abused tenants, but he also didn't tolerate tenants who didn't pay rent. He dealt in facts, not feelings. The courtroom had been small and crowded. 12 cases on the docket that morning, all evictions, all poor people being pushed out by landlords who decided they weren't profitable enough. Helen had been case number 7. She'd sat in the gallery with Amanda beside her, watching the other cases. Most had ended in evictions. The tenants had no lawyers. The landlords had high-priced attorneys who rattled off legal jargon the tenants didn't understand. It had taken less than 5 minutes per case. Assembly line justice. When Helen's name had been called, she'd walked to the front with Amanda, leaning heavily on her walker. Gerald Vickers had been there with his lawyer, a man in his 40s named Preston Hall who looked bored. Judge Kowalski had reviewed the file quickly. This is an eviction for non-payment of rent. Mr. Hall, what's the amount owed? Preston had stood. $12, Your Honor. The tenant was late on her October rent by that amount, which includes a late fee. Judge Kowalski had looked up from the file, his eyebrows raised. $12? Yes, Your Honor. And you're evicting a tenant over $12? The lease is clear. Payment is due in full by the 5th of the month. Mrs. Carver failed to pay in full. Mr. Vickers has the right to evict. Judge Kowalski had turned to Amanda. Ms. Pierce, what's the tenant's position? Amanda had stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Carver has lived in this building for 43 years. She has never been late on rent. Not once. She was $8 short on October 5th due to an accounting error, and she attempted to pay the remainder within 24 hours. She also offered to pay within 3 days. Mr. Vickers refused and immediately filed for eviction. Is the $12 now paid? Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Carver's daughter sent her money the next day. She attempted to pay Mr. Vickers, but he refused to accept it once the eviction was filed. Judge Kowalski had looked at Gerald. Mr. Vickers, why did you refuse payment? Gerald had stood. Your Honor, it's a matter of principle. Tenants need to understand that rent is due on time. If I make exceptions, everyone will think they can pay late. Except Mrs. Carver has never paid late in 43 years. That doesn't matter. The lease, I've read the lease, Mr. Vickers. Judge Kowalski had picked up a piece of paper from the file. And I've read something else. Ms. Pierce, did you file a motion to dismiss? Yes, Your Honor. On what grounds? On the grounds that the late fee charged to Mrs. Carver is illegal under state law. Section 47B of the Landlord-Tenant Code states that late fees must be reasonable and proportional to the actual costs incurred by the landlord. A $12 fee on a rent payment that's $8 short is disproportionate. It's also punitive, which is not allowed. Wait, stop right here. Did you catch that? The late fee itself was illegal. The thing Gerald was using to evict Helen wasn't even legal in the first place. And Judge Kowalski is about to tear into this landlord in a way you need to see to believe. If you think landlords like Gerald deserve to be exposed, drop a comment right now saying Expose them all. And if you're still watching, smash that like button, because what happens next is the definition of justice. This judge isn't playing games. Preston Hall had stood quickly. Your Honor, that's a misinterpretation of the statute. The late fee is standard across Mr. Vickers' properties. I don't care if it's standard. Is it legal? Judge Kowalski had turned to Gerald. Mr. Vickers, what actual costs did you incur because Mrs. Carver's rent was $8 short? Gerald had hesitated. Well, administrative costs, processing time, the cost of filing the eviction. You incurred the cost of filing an eviction because you chose to file an eviction. That's not a cost caused by Mrs. Carver being $8 short. What administrative costs did you incur in those 24 hours? Gerald had said nothing. Judge Kowalski had continued. I'll tell you what you incurred. Nothing. Mrs. Carver came to your office the next day with the full amount. You refused it. You chose to evict her over $12, $8 of which she owed and $4 of which was an illegal late fee, because you wanted to make an example of her. Preston had tried to interrupt. Your Honor, with respect, I'm not finished. Judge Kowalski's voice had been cold. He'd looked at Amanda. Ms. Pierce, you mentioned in your motion that there are other tenants in this building facing similar evictions. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. We've identified 6 other elderly tenants who've been threatened with eviction for amounts ranging from $9 to $37, all with the same late fee structure. Judge Kowalski had turned to Gerald, his face darkening. 6 other tenants, all elderly, all being evicted over pocket change. Gerald had started to speak, but Judge Kowalski had held up his hand. Be quiet, I'm talking. He'd picked up another paper from the file. I've also received a report from the city housing inspector. Apparently, Mrs. Carver filed a complaint 6 months ago about mold in her bathroom and a leaking pipe under her kitchen sink. Neither has been repaired. Is that correct, Mrs. Carver? Helen had nodded, her voice barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. And Mr. Vickers, did you receive notice of these issues? Gerald had shifted uncomfortably. I don't handle day-to-day maintenance. That's the property manager's job. But you were notified? I may have been. You may have been. Judge Kowalski had leaned forward. Let me tell you what I think is happening here, Mr. Vickers. I think you're running a slum. I think you're charging maximum rent, doing minimum maintenance, and evicting tenants who complain or who can't pay every single dollar on time. I think you're targeting elderly tenants specifically because they're vulnerable and don't know their rights. And I think you're using illegal late fees to pad your income. Does that sound about right? Gerald's face had gone red. Your Honor, I object to... You don't get to object. You're not on trial yet. Judge Kowalski had turned to his clerk. Make a note. I'm ordering a full inspection of Riverside Garden Apartments. Housing Authority, Building Code, everything. I want a report on my desk in 30 days. He turned back to Gerald. If what I suspect is true, you're going to face fines. Possibly criminal charges if the violations are severe enough. Preston Hall had stood up, his voice urgent. Your Honor, we'd like to request a recess to discuss. Denied. Sit down. Judge Kowalski had picked up his gavel. Here's my ruling. The eviction is dismissed. The late fee is illegal and is stricken. Mrs. Carver, you don't owe Mr. Vickers anything. In fact, Mr. Vickers, you owe Mrs. Carver. I'm ordering you to refund the $12 she attempted to pay. Plus, I'm awarding her $1,000 in damages for the emotional distress of this frivolous eviction proceeding. The courtroom had gone silent. Helen had gasped. Gerald had gone pale. Preston had started to protest, but Judge Kowalski had cut him off. "I'm not done. Mr. Vickers, I'm also ordering you to pay Mrs. Carver's legal fees. And I'm issuing a temporary restraining order preventing you from filing any evictions against any tenant in Riverside Garden Apartments for amounts under $100 without court approval. You want to evict someone, you come back here and you explain to me why. Understood?" Gerald had stared at the floor. "Yes, Your Honor." "I didn't hear you." "Yes, Your Honor." Gerald's voice had been barely a whisper. Judge Kowalski had brought his gavel down hard. The sound had echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. "Case dismissed. And Mr. Vickers, if I see you in my courtroom again trying to evict an elderly tenant over spare change, I'm going to hold you in contempt and you're going to spend a night in jail thinking about what you've done. Get out of my courtroom." Gerald and Preston had left quickly, their faces ashen. Helen had sat there, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak. Amanda had put her arm around her shoulders. Marcus, who'd been sitting in the gallery, had stood up and had started clapping. Slowly, others had joined in. The courtroom had erupted in applause. Judge Kowalski had banged his gavel again. "Order. We still have 5 more cases." But he'd been smiling. The aftermath had been swift and thorough. The housing inspection Judge Kowalski ordered had revealed over 40 code violations at Riverside Garden Apartments. Mold, leaking pipes, electrical hazards, fire code violations. Gerald had been fined $37,000 and had been given 90 days to make all repairs or face criminal charges. The legal aid organization Amanda worked for had filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the 6 other elderly tenants Gerald had tried to evict. All 6 cases had been dismissed, the tenants had been awarded damages, and Gerald had been ordered to pay all legal fees. The story had made local news. Judge blasts landlord over $12 eviction, orders building inspection. The coverage had been extensive, and the public response had been overwhelmingly supportive of Helen. Gerald's other properties had been inspected as well. More violations, more fines. Within a year, Gerald had been forced to sell all of his buildings. He'd left the rental property business entirely, bankrupt and disgraced. The new owner of Riverside Garden Apartments was a nonprofit housing organization that specialized in affordable senior housing. They'd completed all the repairs, reduced rents by 15%, and had established a hardship fund for tenants who fell behind on rent. Helen's rent had dropped to $550, finally manageable on her Social Security. Helen had lived in Unit 3B for 5 more years. She died peacefully at 94, in her own bed, in the apartment she'd called home for 48 years. At her funeral, Amanda Pierce had spoken about meeting her, about how her case had exposed systematic abuse of elderly tenants, about how one woman's courage had led to protections for thousands. Helen didn't see herself as an activist, Amanda had said. She just wanted to keep her home. But sometimes that's what activism looks like, standing up when you're scared, fighting back when you've been wronged, trusting that maybe, just maybe, someone will listen. Marcus Webb, Helen's neighbor who'd first contacted the legal aid organization, had also spoken. "Helen was my friend, and when I saw that landlord treat her like she was garbage, like 43 years of paying rent on time didn't matter, like she could be thrown away over $12, I got mad. And I'm glad I did. Because look at what happened. One phone call to a lawyer, and everything changed." Judge Kowalski had attended the funeral. He'd sat in the back, hadn't spoken publicly, but had waited until after the service to approach Michelle, Helen's daughter. Your mother was a brave woman. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Michelle had thanked him. You saved her. That apartment was all she had. I just did my job, but I'm glad I could help. Later, reporters had asked Judge Kowalski about the case. He'd been characteristically blunt. What Gerald Vickers did was unconscionable. He exploited vulnerable people for profit. And when I see that in my courtroom, I'm going to call it out, every time. The video of Judge Kowalski's ruling, recorded by the court system and released as public record, had been viewed over 3 million times online. People had shared it with comments like, "This is what justice looks like," and "More judges need to be like this." It had inspired other judges. In courtrooms across the state, judges had started scrutinizing eviction cases more carefully, particularly those involving elderly tenants and small amounts of money. Landlords had learned that they couldn't just rubber stamp evictions anymore, that someone was watching, that there would be consequences. And in law schools, Torres vs. Vickers had become a case study in tenant rights, judicial discretion, and the importance of legal aid for vulnerable populations. Students learned about Helen, about Amanda, about Marcus, about Judge Kowalski. They learned that sometimes the law actually worked the way it was supposed to. Because Helen's case had proven something essential, that $12 could change the world. That one person standing up could create a ripple that became a wave. That justice sometimes wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was an 89-year-old woman keeping her home, a judge who refused to tolerate abuse, and a system that, just this once, chose compassion over cruelty. Gerald Vickers had thought he could throw Helen out like trash. He'd been wrong, and the world had been watching. So here's my final question, and I want you to answer honestly. If you were Helen's neighbor, would you have made that call to the legal aid organization? Would you have gotten involved? Or would you have told yourself it wasn't your business and stayed silent? Because Marcus Webb's decision to pick up the phone changed everything. One action, one phone call. That's the difference between Helen keeping her home and Helen being homeless. Drop your honest answer in the comments. And if this story reminded you that standing up for others isn't optional, it's necessary, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and share this video everywhere, because somewhere right now, another elderly person is being evicted over pocket change. Another landlord thinks they can get away with it. And the only thing that stops them is people like you refusing to look away. Be Marcus Webb. Make the call. Because dignity isn't negotiable, and home isn't just a place. It's everything. What are you going to do about it?